Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this series, we've been talking with Susan Mizrachi, editor of a new book published by Springer Nature called Libraries and Archives in the Digital Age. Susan is a William Arrowsmith Professor in the Humanities at Boston University. She's also director of BU's Center for the Humanities and a professor of English. This series is brought to you by Springer Nature. Susan's book is a uniquely collaborative volume. It brings together contributions from librarians, library directors, and academic scholars that explore the impact the digital era has had on the collection and maintenance of scholarly and communal output in four distinct areas: access, preservation, archival politics, and the profession. While the book provides a wealth of information on the opportunities and challenges digital technology presents for scholarly and archival content, it also shines a bright light on the areas of occupational overlap among academics, librarians, and digital professionals, revealing how important, productive, and rewarding collaboration within an institutional structure can be. In this third episode, Susan and I discuss our digital future, the evolution in politics of preservation, and how librarians are coming to the rescue. The Digital Public Library of America was in the news in early December when it was revealed the organization was in the midst of talks with Amazon to make the online retailers ebooks available to libraries. In his chapter on the digital future of libraries and books, Robert Darnton, University Librarian Emeritus at Harvard, focuses on DPLA and notes that the importance of libraries will only increase as the digital future unfolds. That is, he says, if we can only get it right. And so I'm wondering, there's a little brief moment of concern there on his part, and I'm wondering what that's all about.
Well, he's just a major scholar of the Enlightenment, the French Enlightenment in particular, and and that Enlightenment faith and specialization, really sort of drives everything he's done in his more practical work, working in libraries and working as a founder of the Digital Public Library of America. And I think his main worry is that the enlightened aspirations of DIPLA, what I mentioned before in talking about open access, that the bounty, of let's say, the idea of making all academic libraries open and available to people across the world. It's an astonishing, the idea that the great libraries of the world and open source software and open metadata, that this stuff can be made accessible to every, poor kid in a favela in Brazil who has a cell phone, because every little kid in a favela in Brazil does have a cell phone. And the idea that such a magical thing could happen, through the founding of the DPLA, it's just an astonishing dream. What he's worried about, though, the dark underside that he always talks about is capital. It's the power that major publishing conglomerates hold. I mean, he mentions in his essay they control over 40% of the academic market, and their potential power, to limit and impair this new ideal of openness, just by setting up, firewalls and refusing to share because, their bottom line will be, dramatically impacted. It's right. That's what he's worried about. He's worried about that kind of, competitive struggle. And all I can say is, I do think, his heart is in the right place. Dan Cohen, too, another DIPLA founder, talks about maximal access, which is a different principle, which I think is in some ways even more exciting than open access. Because what he taught, he says that it's not just a matter of making libraries and making this wealth of information available. It's bringing people to utilize it and showing them, how and why all this material can change their lives, and that's a a different order, operation. But in both these cases, I mean, there's, I guess what I would say is, if Cohen and Darnton are working with Amazon, I think we can count on them, negotiating the best possible terms. But
Right.
but it is. But I think that's really that's what he's talking about. And both of these guys are just constantly aware of that tension between profit and access.
Yep. Which librarians and academic librarians in general are also very, very passionate about too.
Yeah.
So the second part of your book deals with preservation and community. In her chapter called "Radical Record Keeping: How Community Archives Are Changing How We Think About Records," Jeanette Bastian says that traditional institutional archives are being challenged by the emergence of community-based archiving. Beyond that, she notes that community archives are also challenging the traditional perspectives of what an archive actually is and how they're built. So I'd be curious to hear you explain that a bit more, about how community archives are evolving the practice and profession.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because this, as I mentioned before, community archives was a subject that I probably knew least about, and I think
Hmm.
of the issues that came up in our forum and that, our contributors, our participants were addressing. And the exciting thing for me was just to understand from her research how grassroots, community archives are. That you could even say it represents a kind of populist movement in the field of archives, and there's a kind of energy and independence that these groups have that really sort of drives a monkey wrench, into traditional archival methods and institutional demands. I mean, these people, they're driven, community archives and the people who run them. I mean, they're driven by a thirst to establish and, often recuperate individual and collective identities.
Hmm.
They're, I mean, these identities are dependent on, they're grounded in the recover of memories, of these material memories. And so, I think there's a kind of purity here, that's absolutely mobilizing, and I mean, you could say that in a way it's sort of, I mean, I think the community archives movement is kind of, just designed to challenge, the inertia that's, generated by professionalization and
Hmm.
and institutional protocols, which, I mean, look, I mean, all that is necessary. I mean, professionalization, institutional protocols, they're part of what make things run smoothly. They're, we need them, but I think there's a kind of energy and even volatility in the community archives movement that's also very necessary, and that and I think that's, why she has the title "Radical Record Keeping."
Right. Sort of a little activism in there too.
Yeah,
I would
yeah,
think.
it's
Yeah. Yeah.
activist. I mean,
Yeah.
and it's connected. See, I mean, the archives themselves and building archives and locating archives is an activist, agenda.
Yeah.
And I, that is something too that I think I've learned in working in this area and meeting people from so many different, organizations, and different sort of professional capacities, doing this kind of work, that I do think that it is a form of activism, and it's very practical, and you can get I don't know what the word is, but self-satisfied, or lazy in academia, and not recognize how the kind of impact that intellectual and that books can have. I mean, we know
Yeah.
this from our teaching. We do know this, but I think we forget sometimes.
Right. So this sense that if it's not happening within academia, then maybe it's not being paid attention to or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or just that, the idea that there's we get involved in our insular debates, as academics. And I think we and that's why I draw the analogy to teaching. I think that, when you teach a book to students, I mean, the meaning of the book for them and it, the importance of a character's behavior to them is what they care about. And I do think that, it's really grounding and invaluable for us to, be confronted with those kinds of burning questions. And I think, in some sense, the community archives movement works in that fashion, vis-a-vis sort of the larger project of, libraries and archives.
Right. So the third section of your book examines the political issues swirling around archives and archival practices, which we've touched on a little bit. And Maurice Lee's chapter called Globalism, Transparency, and Loss takes, as you say in your introduction, a classically skeptical stance. And I'm wondering, what is it about digital archiving that inspires this skepticism? There's a great quote in his introduction to his chapter where he says, long the subject of utopian dreams, our digital revolution can feel suddenly limited, as if failing to achieve escape velocity from history's gravitational pull.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is Mo is a skeptic. That's his thing. I've known him, for a long time, and we're fellow in the same department, and so it is partly, sort of particular to his intellect, but I think there's no question that, it's also a kind of, it's a poignant consequence, I think, of the digital turn, that, it's unleashed all of these hopes and dreams, the promise, and again, I think you see this in the Digital Public Library of America and its, great ambitions, to amass all of this, intellectual and creative bounty and make it available to a kind of global citizenry. I mean, it's heartening and also heartbreaking, to reflect on, on the dreams, that and the ambitions that has unleashed and the impasses, counter movements that it runs up against, and I think, whether we're talking about profit, as in the case of, sort of thinking about book conglomerates, publishing conglomerates. But I think another issue here too is that, there's a dark side to our information age. I mean, the expansion of information, of the internet, of our, various sites, it's led to kind of troubling developments like hacking, the rise of pornography. I mean, archives, any group can have an archive. Any group can, exchange, information, media messages in innovative ways. And our innovations have led to dark and even oppressive, developments too. So I do think he's confronting, these kinds of counter movements. He's thinking implicitly about, the ways in which, and I think it's just, this is human experience,
Yeah. Well, you hear so much about, how users are the product, with a lot of these, especially among social media platforms or, and so on, where there's so much data being thrown out there that's sort of what's being bought and sold now.
Yeah. And, I think one problem too is just that there's, it's just an avalanche. I mean, there's so much. And that, I mean, I don't think he actually used this title, but he just finished a book on data and literary culture. And I think he was going to call it Overwhelmed. But, you do feel at times too that there's a way in which we are just so saturated, with information. And I think that's part of the dark side, that, people talk about, taking holidays from their phone, from their internet.
Right. Yeah.
Well, there's lots of books in the library.
Yeah, exactly. You just heard from Susan Mizrachi, who edited Libraries and Archives in the Digital Age. Susan is a William Arrowsmith Professor in the Humanities at Boston University. She's also Director of BU Center for the Humanities and a Professor of English. This series is brought to you by Springer Nature. Join us next week when we continue our conversation and talk about how new working relationships solidified out of necessity during the pandemic might continue to produce fruitful results.
One consequence of the pandemic and the pervasiveness of Zoom, may be that it's easier for us to reach out because we don't have to go anywhere. We just, get on Zoom. We just send an email and we ask someone, in a different area, if they want to, talk to us about X. And there's a greater chance potentially of the kinds of exchanges that, that we've been talking about throughout this conversation happening potentially. So I do wonder to some extent whether that might not be a kind of silver lining in the cloud of the pandemic, that people learn to collaborate more.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.